Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Gloria Pearson. I just want to thank all of you, first of all, for your participation in this process, for working with Navigant to get the best information to them so that we can give them all the information they need to help us to realign our division to be the best it can be. And I want to thank the Navigant team for all your work. You guys have done a great job, and it appears that there's some really exciting things for us. And I know it's always a little bit challenging when you're in the middle of a transition or a reorganization. It can be a little unnerving, but I just want you to try to think about the positive of this and the challenges and opportunities we'll all have to learn and grow and make our division better. So I think that's really exciting. I hope you do too. And again, I just want to thank you all for your participation, because you guys are the folks that are going to, make this all happen, and we'll be able to take advantage of some of the best practices that we are now aware of as a result of the work that Navigant's done, and look forward to the presentation. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Yvette. I want to just echo Gloria's comments. I thank you for your participation, both in the interviews with Navigant and completing the online surveys. All of that information was very valuable. I think we have some great opportunities here, and I would just ask that you be patient as you go through as Navigant goes through the presentation, because sometimes things look a little different right at first and it makes you go, but if you just pause and reflect, I think that you'll find it a little more comfortable once you get a chance to think about it and how it can help us do a better job going forward. So thank you, and thanks to you guys for coming here and doing this for us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. I'm going to kick it off. We're going to rotate around who's doing what sections of the presentation. I'm Martha Rorty. I'm the Executive Director of NASUAD, which represents all of the state aging and disability agencies. And Jay, over here, my counterpart from Navigant, was my former board president when he was the director in Georgia. So we've worked together a long time, and Dustin's my new favorite nudge from Navigant, who kept me on task as we were working together as partners. There's a lot of information, as Gloria and Yvette shared. I am the mother of 5, however, so that means I'm used to cold food and lots of interruptions and questions. So feel free at any point to interrupt us. We're going to try and do this kind of in stages where I'll share some information, then Jay will share some information, then Dustin, but all of us will be kind of adding on if I forget to say something or one of the others forgets to say something. The basic outline today for the presentation is we're going to talk about the project overview. We'll go through the key findings and recommendations, and that's going to include the organizational structure, the communication strategy, technology, some staffing distributions, quality measures and metrics, some issues around law enforcement. You're skipping too fast, sorry. It's okay. Case management, and then we'll have a discussion of the next steps.
And one point I will add, we're going to be trying to monitor the Skype messaging. So if you have questions, you can certainly ask questions in that format as well, because I know we have a lot of people on the phone, so it may be hard to ask questions via phone call, but we'll be monitoring the Skype message board to address some of your questions.
Do you want to go next?
Yes.
First thing is, I also want to add my thanks to Gloria's and Yvette's and Beth's. I know very much appreciate all the time and effort that all of the staff has put into this project. I know that sometimes when people come in from the outside and are asking you questions, both in-person interviews, telephone interviews, and then the surveys that we were doing, there probably was some reluctance to share in the beginning, but I was very pleased with the number of honest comments and conversations that we were able to have with individuals. I also want to just share, as somebody who represents all of the state agencies on aging and disabilities, you should be quite proud of your agency and your agency's leadership, in that a lot of people state leaders won't ask. They'll just go in and make the changes wholesale. And then I'm brought in on the back end to say, how can you help me fix all this? And I'm like, well, you could have asked the staff in the first place. So I think that they've done a great job of kind of getting your feedback on what things you think needs to be changed. And I hope that when we're going through the report, you're going to see a lot of the comments reflected and in the changes that we recommended. The PowerPoint, the report, like any good consulting companies, the report is about this big, and it's too dense. And we understand you had HIPAA training this morning, so you don't need more dense. So instead, we've condensed it to the things that we think are really key and critical for you to hear and that we can share with you. So as I shared earlier, we're going to talk and highlight in high level about the organizational structure, communication strategy, technology, APS, quality, and then case management. The report that we did was based on a number of things. As I shared with you, we did come out and do in-person interviews twice. We were able to do that. We also managed to get a lot of you also on the phone. I have a notebook. I'm old school sometimes, so I take notes by hand. I have a notebook full of notes. We had the younger millennials also typing away, but we did a survey gizmo that I was very pleased that so many of you filled that out from NASUAD staff with Navigant's participation too. Navigant staff did a amazing review of documents. We did a national survey on adult protective services that helped to feed into this so that we could get the promising practices from other states. And then we also did a review of some of the other state practices in certain areas that we wanted to just make sure that South Dakota was in alignment with the other states. So it wasn't just, we came up with these ideas. We really, I think you'll see that we were trying to be really thoughtful on it. Next. Now you can go next. So one of the other really exciting things I think is that, and this is another thing that I want to just call out. South Dakota didn't wait for the whole report to come out. I think Yvette and Beth were amazing in that they were already implementing some of the things that we wanted to put into the report. So there are some things that are already done because we would point them out and they would say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, done. That's very rare in leadership that they can pivot like that. So I think that's a really good thing. And you'll see like Dakota at Home has already been done and changed, and the guardianship. So I think those things are amazing that it's already been done. They've already been actively planning a lot of the implementation of some of the other recommendations that you'll see. There are some that are going to have to come in stages, though, based on just the time it takes and the intensity. There's a lot of changes included in the overall report, and you can't do all of them all at once. Some of them will require some budgetary changes. We're hoping we gave enough groundwork in the document that it would be a nice tool to take to the legislature and ask for additional funding if you need some of that, but there's just some things that will take time. I think the new THERAP system, that will show and provide a lot more data than you've been able to have or for us to review, and I think that will open up some other opportunities. And then some, again, will just have to be delayed based on if there's not enough budget or staffing. You guys, I also should share, just based on my work in the other states, this is a very small staff. There aren't any area agencies on aging on top of it. So on top of being a small state staff, then having no area agencies on aging, it's amazing how much you're able to accomplish with the staff that you have. I felt like, I know I said this when we were doing the interviews with Jay, when was it? Months ago, that sometimes I'd get off the phone and I'd be exhausted for you. We do really understand and appreciate how much you're trying to do. In a lot of states, a specialist is a specialist. They have one job, and we know that that's not the case here, so we don't want you to feel like we didn't hear that message loud and clearly. I also shared with Gloria yesterday that NASUAD is a very small staff too, and all of my staff have quadruple things, so sometimes when I take a second, I felt like I was looking in a mirror back at myself and saying, oh, I should be better at this and this and this. So it's been a great state to be working on. So the next is the first area of consideration was really to reorganize your organizational structure. So I know that you've already had the change of moving over to the new division, and so you're probably going, what? But really, after we did all of the interviews and we completed them all, what Jay and I and Dustin and Veronica were looking at was really how do you align what you're doing not along the lines of kind of the people that are in the position and their personalities and their strengths, but really more around the functions of long-term services and support. So what do the functional divisions look like so that you can align them by projects to make a lot more sense. I see a lot of people taking notes furiously, and we will send out the PowerPoint so that everybody can have them. You can still take notes. I know sometimes that's helpful, but I just didn't want you to think you wouldn't see this.
I think the plan too is to share an executive summary. So as Martha was talking about, we're only talking about a select number of recommendations, but the executive summary will capture all of those 43 recommendations that we include in the report.
Not
all
to
43.
overwhelm you or anything, but I'm trying to minimize it. As I said, we're trying to realign the functions so that they are more around the functional areas. And then we saw a real need, based on the interviews in most parts, for both a separate functional area for business operations so that there's somebody that in an area that's focusing on the grant writing, the communication, the training needs that you have, developing of contracts, so that each one of you isn't having to learn to specialize in those things. And then having a real robust quality assurance division that will be helpful for both your work at the Administration on Community Living and CMS and fulfilling their requirements there, but also for driving your own performance and then seeing how you are improving and if there are areas that need more attention or not.
As well as public policy within the state. So a lot of it's driven by the federal initiatives and reporting that's required at the federal level, but what we noticed, and I think what a lot of you, especially those of you who work in the state office, realized was public policy in the state is driven by the information and detailed level of information you're able to give policymakers, your legislatures, your governors, your secretaries, and that was really difficult to generate and to be responsive to some of those needs and some of those demands, and that quality assurance piece and ensuring that the data is available, it's accessible, it's reliable, is something that gives both Yvette and Gloria kind of the confidence they need in order to have these discussions that might, be necessary over the next few years.
So in terms of the staff assignments too, you'll see the little bullet that says realign staff. We said that the staff should be realigned along the new structure, and the next slide will show you the functional structures. Redistribute some of the clerical work. We heard a lot of concern about how much clerical work there is. Specializing waiver versus non-waiver services and who's doing that so that there's a better distribution. And then making sure that for adult protective services there are leads for those heavier adult protective services.
And I guess one important note that we have in here is that there will be obviously no reductions in staff, and all of our recommendations around staffing is really just to make things easier for you. We know a big concern from you all was all the administrative tasks, and some folks said that they spent right around like 40% of their time just doing data entry. So the hope is the new Therap system, the call center, will alleviate a lot of that and free up staff to work on some of these new areas that Martha will walk through in the organizational chart.
So this is the new, this doesn't look like any org chart you've ever seen, and that's because it's really based on the functional divisions that we were talking about. So we have included in here non-waiver and Older Americans Act field operations. It's separated from waiver field operations, and then an elder rights division. And then information and referral, long-term care, and home and community-based programs. You can see underneath there are really 2 additional functional areas, I'm talking and walking, that we said before, I'm loud, business operations and quality assurance, and they'll be reporting through all of those other operations and those cylinders, as you see, because we think that those needs are for everybody. We also heard from the interviews that we had that people didn't know when to talk to, when they needed to go to Beth and when they needed to go to Yvette for certain things. So we felt like by dividing it this way, there's more of a clear distinction that if you have a question on these areas, you go to Beth, and at these areas, you go to Yvette. That's not to say you cut either one of them out of things, but just for clarity, those functional areas would go to those directors. The Ombudsman, by federal regulation, has a dotted line to Yvette, but it's definitely a kind of a reporting structure. It's just by federal regulation they have to have a little bit more autonomy than the rest of the agencies. But that's set up in the federal statute or regulation. Sorry. Next. You know what? No. Go ahead. That's fine. I can do it this way. Just so you understand a little bit more about what's included in each of those cylinders too, we wanted to give you a little bit more clarity. So in the non-waiver field ops, that would include case management. It's going to include caregiver services. The Older Americans Act would all be included in that non-waiver. Then in the waiver field operations, that's going to be the specifically waiver case management. Elder rights is going to have law enforcement, legal assistance, and adult protective services. Kind of the Title VII of the Older Americans Act kind of function is going to be in the elder rights bucket. Information and referral is going to include Dakota at Home, basic INR, information and referral and assistance that you do currently. The SHINE program will be included in that bucket. The Senior Medicare Patrol, the MIPA program, anything that a consumer is calling and asking for information basically about a certain program will go into that bucket. And then the volunteer coordinator will also be in that bucket. A lot of the states, when we did the research on this particular bucket, we found that through their Aging and Disability Resource Center, and a lot of their specialists even are being trained with the basic information on all of those programs so that they can answer the questions as consumers call through.
We have a question. What is MIPA?
MIPA is Medicare Improvement
Patient
Protection Act. There we go.
It's a grant under our SHINE program.
Yeah, sorry. It's a grant under the SHINE program, and it's basically to provide additional assistance to people that are Medicare eligible that are usually low income and disabled. But it's also not utilized as much as it should be because there's not, in most states, I'm not picking on South Dakota, in most states, we even have an initiative at the federal level to get more people to know about it so that they can reduce the burden for individuals with disabilities. So it's a perfectly appropriate place to, when you're doing your overall analysis in the beginning, to determine what services somebody's eligible to provide them with that kind of purview if they're eligible for MIPA. The long-term care little cylinder will have in it the pass-hour program, and if they're eligible for that. The Money Follows the Person program, Section Q, and the ad pay. The ad pay, we heard a lot about the fact that it's a lot of clerical, and that will be also, once it's verified by the people in that program that they're really eligible for it, the footnote on that says that we understand that business operations can just pay for that. It mostly will be business operations, but there's going to be a little bit of review at that level. Home and community-based services programs will include home and community-based services like the waiver, in-home services, provider oversight, community living, the nutrition programs, transportation, respite. There'll also be the local contact agency. And then business operations, as I shared before, will include things like contracts, claims, oversight, special projects, grants, finance, budgeting. All of those will go in there. And then quality assurance will be reports, the critical incident management piece, training will be included in this because obviously if things are getting a lower quality score, you might need additional training. And then the National Core Indicators project will be included in there, and then waiver quality assurance measures will be included in there.
And so really, I think the important message from this is we haven't created a lot of these activities, so a lot of these activities should be familiar to you all. It's more about how we align the activities with the function or area. And even for some of these activities, there may be, because of your current staffing dynamic, there may be one person that oversees different activities across these different functional areas. But when we look at this and we look at the functional areas, I guess the only area that I would, think of as new is the quality assurance area. And that's really bringing together the activities you all are doing for quality and enhancing it and adding some additional thought into how that's run.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that's not to say that you weren't, you didn't care about quality before, but really calling it out and saying it's so important that we're going to call it a separate functional area, I think is, it's very unique in the structure. I think it will also put you ahead of the curve in terms of what other states are doing. And as the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services is paying more and more attention right now, to critical incidents reporting, I think having this bucket already out and saying, look, we read the reports from the federal government. We understand that this is something that's really important, so we're already going to go ahead and create this unit to review these things. I think it will send a strong message and will hopefully put you out on top when CMS is looking at this. Okay. So we also heard a lot of concern about the communication and the transfer of information and knowledge from central office down into the regional offices, and a little bit of discussion about the kind of the disconnect of what's happening at the state versus the local. This is something I want to share again. This is not a unique thing that's happening in South Dakota versus some of the other states we've done work in, but there are some ways that we think that we can help to improve it. 67% of the respondents said that the chain of command and the funneling of information was a barrier to communication, and 52% of the staff said that they didn't feel comfortable in escalating issues to the state office. I think some of that was a concern about they didn't know who to really relay the information up. So we've got some recommendations on here. The first is that we're going to increase the interactions between the division leadership and the field staff. We've recommended that there's a regular on-site and off-site interactions between the leadership here and the people out in the field, so that they're scheduled and that there's a regular, rigorous dialogue. There's the implementation of a strategic internal communication strategy on when things are communicated and how. So that will include, as I shared, the biannual meetings with the leadership and the division staff. So twice a year you'll actually get together. I think we've been really excited that I think we've had 2 already meetings with people here. But I think that will be really helpful to have more regular communication. We discussed putting a staff newsletter together. My first instinct, I have to say, when we discussed this was, oh, that's more work for somebody. I hear you. But I think it's also a really important step to take, that there's some celebratory things, for example, that can be included in a newsletter. You know, somebody's birthday, somebody's been with the division for a long time. I think in addition to sharing information about, today we're going to talk about MIPA, and it doesn't have to be that much work if you put together a newsletter. I do see the notion going, oh, it's extra work, but I think it would be really helpful, and I think that based on the feedback that we heard from you all, I think that it would be something that would be really helpful. Anytime there's an update, I think it can be something that goes out. And I'll give you as an example, how many of you see the Friday update from NASUAD? Okay, a couple. So the reason that I started the Friday update, which is an online newsletter that we do on Fridays, was because when I first started at NASUAD 10 years ago, every time I had an important thing that I wanted the directors and commissioners to know, I sent an email. And then I realized that I was swamping the boxes of the members to the point where they weren't reading anything I was sending. So we created this newsletter that goes out then just on Fridays, and it's a quick read, and it's all linkable back, so if they want to see more detail, they can. If there's something that's much more of a priority, then it goes out with this is a priority, you know, you need to do something today on this. But they know that if they need just regular communication, it goes on Fridays. It's something that the staff are able to do in a couple of hours and send out, and it's really saved both the email boxes for all the members, but also provide some formalized method of communication with everybody. So I think it's worked successfully for us. We also suggested having a formal, and I know there are policy memos, but more formalized policy memos with a standardized template so that you can refer back to them that explain what your changes are or what the changes in leadership decision makings are, and address the questions that you might have. And then Jay and the Navigant team also came up with, when you have meetings, that they follow this standardized meeting agenda, which allows for all of the staff to know what is going to be in the meetings, and allows you to have input into each of the areas as well. And if you have questions, they would be able to be easily filtered up into the standardized agenda. Does anybody have any questions thus far on any of the things that we've talked about or touched base on?
And we're really, for communications, really trying to focus on adding some structure, then adding some policy framework for how you all are doing things today. And so I know you're talking about formal policies. So we work with states now that have a process where they have a standard template that they use, and then when a policy is made, they send out a mass email to everyone, but then they also use a database, and the database categorizes the different policies that the agencies use. So all staff can go to the database and keep attuned to what's happening and what changes are being made.
So the next slide is somewhat confusing. I see everybody going, what the heck?
Jay and I were like, Martha is going to talk about this slide.
So we were trying to come up with a way in picture form that talks about the way in which communications are going to be shared with each of you, because that, as we said, was very confusing or it wasn't confusing conversation. Many of you expressed concern, both you in the room, but you on the phone as well, that you didn't know who to ask a question of. So this is our really confusing way probably, I'm sorry, of explaining what and I'm going to explain it so that it's not confusing, I hope, of how you can get your questions answered. So, and it's really also providing for more authority for certain individuals to be the ones that are the repositories of the information and helping to have them answer the questions more than always having to go to certain other people. So as we shared, I want to go over here and I want to be near the mic at the same time, but I'm going to do it both. Okay, so as we shared, the functional areas are these areas which are on the green arrow line for those that are on the phone. On these areas, these are going to be the subject matter experts too. So if you're in the field staff and you have a question as a LTSS specialist, the first line that we're asking you to do is to ask your supervisor. Your supervisor then is going to be directly communicating with those functional experts if they have a question. But we're hoping that the supervisors also are going to be able to, because there's more people that they can ask that are the functional leads in those areas, that they also will begin to develop more of an ability to answer those questions directly. So on that green line, the supervisors are going to be communicating with the functional area experts. Does that make sense to everybody so far? The gray circle is it includes the communications internally to the state office. That's basically what the gray circle means. So in the gray circle, includes all the people that are mostly doing the functional leads, and then has the deputy director. Yvette's responsibility, as you can see, is whenever there's a major change in policy that she needs to communicate, going forward, she's going to communicate directly to everybody through a mass email so that it comes directly from her down, so that you understand that that change really was coming from the top, and it's really critical that you receive it directly from Yvette. Obviously, Beth can talk to Beth as well, and the director can talk to the ombudsman, and the ombudsman can talk up to Yvette. That's what that dotted line is. Then there's going to be the blue circles here. It's hard to see all these colors. I'm so sorry. There's going to be 2 additional managers. These are currently these are the regional managers. Our proposal is that we divide their expertise up into 2 different buckets of expertise. One would be non-waiver, which would include all those other programs that we talked about, and then the other is the waiver, so that there's a level of expertise that you can have another person that's over those things and can help with the quality assurance as well. Any questions on all of that? Simple chart? But again, we put the other slide first so that you would see that there's the, in the longer report, there's an explanation of like what the agendas would look like, how often, when you would communicate, the email and stuff like that. You've got a lot of and the next discussion is really on technology too, but you've got a lot of the tools. You've been using Skype, you've got a lot of instant messaging, you've got some things that you can start to use even more now that you know really who you're going to be communicating the flow to, I think.
Yeah, and I guess I'd reiterate that, and we haven't spent a whole lot yet on the case management component to it, but in the surveys, the interviews that we did, that's where a lot of the questions that you have, that's what you bump up against roadblocks, you bump up against barriers, because there's so much to know. And you go to your supervisor, but there's only so much you can know about each one of these programs and have the right answers for. And the regional managers were put in that position where they were supposed to be these uber knowledge keepers, where they had or were supposed to have ready access to everything. And then if they didn't, we had the state office. So you experience these, at different levels, different barriers. And we'll get into it a little bit with the specialization of the case management and also the regional managers specializing in this, now I'm responsible for just waiver. Now it's only one thing I need to be knowledgeable about instead of 80 different things that I just need to be superficially knowledgeable about because nobody can know that much. So all this feeds up into this help eliminate a lot of the barriers that you encountered in trying to get answers, creating the subject matter experts at the supervisor, regional manager level, but recognizing that each person, each section manager, each lead at the state office is expected to have this direct communication on programmatic issues, on policy issues around their programs. That we're trying to eliminate those barriers that you encountered in the past with some of this. Still putting in place a little bit of a valve, so to speak, so people aren't overwhelmed, and that's some development that needs to happen once some of these changes start happening. Is now that I'm responsible as a supervisor for this program, now I need to really know the policy because it's only this one program I have to be knowledgeable about now. So that development has to happen along with yours as a case manager's development on. Now I need to know my program really well instead of, again, the 18 different programs that you're responsible for now. So
I think that again aligns with when we talk about staffing the specialization is to make things easier for you all and for you all to build a deeper understanding of that particular area. And we have some slides we'll get to on that as well.
So the next key area is on technology and the use of technology. Is there a question?
No,
Okay.
I'm just making sure that I'm logged in and I can see the slides advance. So
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're QCing each other.
QC.
So in 2007 was when the iPhone was introduced. And I was reflecting on that just recently when I gave a presentation because we're also dependent now on our technology and our mini computers that are in our phone, right? But I don't think that any state government has maximized the use of technology to the way that the strongest ability that they can. My mother has just recently had a bad fall, and I'm doing some of the healthcare work with her. And I have literally downloaded on my mother's phone a scanner, so she scans in her bills each week, and I pay them. And that's the kind of thing that, and my mother's 84, so I'm saying that I think we can begin to pick up the pace a little bit in all of state government to make the use of technology simplify our positions. I'm not the best. I can't program my own DVR. I'm not going to lie. But I am getting better in terms of what I can utilize it for. Some of this is scary because it is going to require you to stop with the paper and pen and just really use the technology to the fullest extent possible. But we heard a lot of people still relying on the old. And in order for the efficiencies and the quality to improve, we're going to have to improve the use of the technology too. So one of the things from the findings that we had was that 35% of the staff indicated the single data system would allow them to do their jobs more efficiently. We heard that. We heard that about 50% of the staff said that data entry and re-entry, which is key, I think the re-entry was what they were spending their time on. So they'd go out and fill out something in paper and then recode it when they got back to the office. And then almost 80% said they wish they had access to smartphones to access resources when they're out in the field. That's a startling number. So some of the recommendations that we have was to supply the staff with additional equipment to improve your efficiency in the field, in addition to using the technical support and the tools and resources that you currently have available to you. If you have the laptops and then you're not using them because you're using paper, that we have to break some of those habits. I also think that we're really encouraged with THERAP and hoping that THERAP will help to, the new data system will help with this to be able to track some performance measures. We're going to go into the performance measures and all of the things that Navigant has recommended that the state look at in terms of a dashboard of metrics. None of this will work if we're not all using the technology to report on this and to report and input things. And then to automate some of the assessments and pre-populate some of the fields so that you're not keying over the same things over and over and over again. I mean, the nice things like when you're ordering something online and you fill in your credit card with your address and then it says, is the billing address the same? Those are the kinds of things that we're hoping that the state can help to automate for you so that you're not having to refill it in over and over again.
And I would say this is probably the biggest opportunity for you all to reduce that the amount of time you all are spending doing the administrative tasks. We've seen other states use effectively their case management systems to populate and to drive a lot of the quality measures. So the system itself is actually calculating what those measures are, and it's something they're able to pull real time and look at. And then also, as Martha was talking about, having what's in the system talk to each other. So you fill in a document somewhere and then also populates another form that's being used, all with the purpose of reducing the amount of time that you all have to spend in the system itself.
But it also is, if you think of it in terms of a quality for the consumer that's being interviewed, it also improves their quality of service so that they're not having to repeat the questions 6 times to 6 different people, because it will all be included into in pre-populated so that they don't have to answer the questions over and over again. Next slide, I think. Yeah, okay.
Great. All right, so next couple of slides we're going to talk about, and we've already alluded to a lot of these items, is staff specialization. So the first slide here, we'll talk about the specialization of case management, and then also partial specialization of APS, and I'll talk about what partial means in the next couple of slides. And Jay and I already talked about some of the benefits of specialization. It's really for you all to really build a deeper understanding in the program area and service area. Right now, you all are having to understand a whole slew of different programs and services, and it's difficult from what we heard from the interviews from staff to get a handle and becoming comfortable with all that information. Another reason for specialization is there may be some opportunities for a potential higher federal match. And we noticed from looking at the time study that was done last year that you all indicated from that 33% of time was spent on waiver-related services. And from different data points that we looked at and based on feedback we received from the interviews, we found that percentage to be low. So this is really an opportunity for you all to potentially get more funding if it ends up being that you all are actually spending a lot more time on waiver services. And then you could use that extra funding for additional staff or to improve on some of the different data components that you have or systems you have in place. And so one thing we wanted to share is just an illustration of how this could potentially work out. And the biggest caveat is this is just an example only. So
let's say it again.
Example only. So
you're not reassigned to these regions.
Yeah. So we pulled this together really to see if it's something that's even feasible. And from the data that we had available, it's certainly something that's feasible. And we looked at the number of cases and we looked at staff in each region, and we made some initial estimates on what that may potentially look like for waiver versus non-waiver. So we have 6 regions here, and then each region would have staff that are devoted to waiver and then staff that are devoted to non-waiver. And one thing you'll probably notice is the variation in caseload, and that's really just dependent on the number of cases in that particular region and the number of staff that are available. We would expect in the final, I guess, determination of how this would work out would incorporate time estimates that are spent on doing these cases, because right now when we looked at this data, it was really just looking at cases and looking at staff and how that may work out. But the biggest component and the biggest driver is how much time it actually spends to do these things. So that would be a huge driving factor in what the map may ultimately look like. The same we wanted to do for supervisors is what supervision may look like if we were to specialize waiver and non-waiver. So you can see from the map on the left, we have specialization for waiver. So based on, we looked at 7 supervisors, and you're probably wondering, okay, we have 9, where are the other two going? So what we are proposing is that you have 7 supervisors that manage, 2 that manage waiver and 5 that manage non-waiver. And then you have 2 that would be freed up to work in new functional areas that we talked about, maybe quality, maybe business operations. But again, this is really just to illustrate what this may potentially look like. And you can also see from the map that a supervisor, depending on if they're waiver or non-waiver, may have to supervise folks across multiple regions. So you can see from non-waiver that for the most part, those staff will just oversee one region. But when we look at waiver, just because the number of cases that are out there, those folks would have to supervise people across multiple regions. And then the second area that we are recommending you all consider is a partial specialization of APS. And what that means is, and what we're recommending is you all assign APS leads. So an APS lead would be primarily responsible for doing the intake of APS, the investigations, basically the entire function of what an APS person should be responsible for. But given the geographic nature of your state and where the cases are located, that those APS leads would still continue to have a caseload. Okay.
Well, I just want to say that this is one of those areas where we say that the recommendation may be partially implemented further downstream when funding resources are available. It might look a little bit differently. This is one that from the beginning, and every state that I've worked with, and I've administered 2 protective services programs in 2 different states, actually 3, when you look at elder protective services and adult protective services and then the combined programs, that we felt really strongly that they should be dedicated APS. But because of just a lack of data, reliable data long-term, and how reporting might be done, we had a really hard time justifying from the get-go that these folks are specialized. Now, I do believe after the first year, with the changes that were made with the code at home, with the specialization, and how we centralize the intake, that it won't be very long before these individuals become primarily APS, if not 100% protective services investigations. But starting off, just to be cautious, because we know the impact it may have, that it would have across the state with caseloads, because those caseloads have to shift. We're being somewhat conservative in saying that they're going to carry a mixed caseload. So they're going to be your go-to folks for investigations. So we have folks who are really competent in investigations. They're comfortable with it, because we heard that a lot. That a lot of you who only get an investigation once every 3 months or 6 months or once a year aren't comfortable doing that. You don't feel safe. You don't really know or feel like you have the skill to conduct that investigation. So these folks would be your primarily conducting investigations, and then Yvette and then the elder rights section would really have to look at those caseloads and manage to make sure that what they're doing, the priority is still for them an APS, and shift cases as it needs. But I think after the first year, 2 years, they'll become kind of dedicated primarily APS investigators.
And LTSS specialists would still receive basic training for APS, but wouldn't necessarily have this thorough, detailed training that we would expect from someone in APS lead. And as Jay was referring to as well, during the implementation, we would still expect that LTSS specialists would still do some of the APS investigations, just because you all are first starting and not sure on what the impact will actually be for these APS leads and how much time they'll actually have available to just do APS and so forth. So during the initial stages, we would still expect the LTSS specialists to play an active role in doing APS investigations. But during the end, maybe a year or so down the road, that would be limited, and in rare situations in which the APS leads are just so overwhelmed that they need someone else to come in and do it.
I think one other thing I just wanted to dovetail, well, 2 things. One is on APS, just like with the Medicaid, there's an ability to draw down federal dollars, Medicaid dollars on APS for the case management portion, and you can drive up, how many people staff-wise you can have if you can draw down effectively for the APS workers. That is going to require the real diligence in terms of making sure your reporting and your data and your technology is all being used. So all of these are really connected, because we can improve the efficiency and the effectiveness. We can look at the maps with better data and systems. We can drive the quality. But if we're not reporting correctly, then we won't be able to do any of that. And so some of this feels, I know, because I have to do like timesheets for Dustin. I know it can feel overwhelming, But we had this director in Alabama years ago. She was Jay's predecessor as president, and she used to say, data drives dollars. So think of it in terms of that. All that technology and stuff is, and all the data elements that we're asking you to report on, it really can drive dollars, improve staffing, et cetera. So including an APS.
Yeah. And there are some additional benefits to you, kind of frontline folks. I know you have to fill out the time survey on a regular basis, where you're reporting your hours in 15-minute increments and what you did for those 15 minutes. For those individuals who move to primarily waiver case management, then 100% of your time is now waiver case management. So your time study changes dramatically. You're reporting 1, maybe 2 activities versus what you have available now. Those of you who are waiver or non-waiver case managers, now all those different things that were available because you also did waiver services, you don't have to keep track of that. Now your universe of options shrinks because you're now specialized to some extent. So it makes the time study a little bit easier, which should make the data somewhat more reliable. And that time study, and I don't know if you're aware or not, drives the federal match that's being able to pull down to the agency. So we know from talking to you that 50 to 60% of your time spent on waiver activities, kind of as we talk to individuals, yet the federal drawdown is close to 30%.
Yeah.
You know, so there's a 20% of your time, and you calculate that in dollar amount that the agency isn't able to benefit from to create new staffing positions and new case management positions, that once we kind of specialize, and now we have X number of people who are 100% waiver activity only, 100% of their salary is matchable, it's really easy to do, and then you're generating 40 to 50% more in funding that's available within that program. So those are some things that we kind of say, you know, that you're not going to realize it immediately, but 6 months into the process, when you start looking at your federal pull down, you're going to start realizing that there's extra budget that we never had before in these programs, because we're much more accurate in how we're accounting for the time and the federal match that's available to us.
I think I forgot to say one additional thing. See, this is what happens when you put me down. One of the reasons that we also wanted to create those functional buckets before was we did hear really clearly that there's a concern among some of the staff about how you can grow in your career in state government, because there's not a big trajectory of moving up. By specializing a little bit more, there are certifications that are available for certain programs. There's training that you can go to for adult protective services. And you can't do that if you're doing a little bit of everything, right? Because there's no way that the state can afford to send the entire state staff to APS conferences for training or something. But they can probably send a handful of staff if they're specializing in APS and they have the ability to draw down the match. They can do some more robust Medicaid training for those that are specializing in Medicaid. Does that make a little bit of sense too? But you also have the ability to have a little bit more of a unique ability to move up based on your functional skills that you're trying to develop. So you can start as a supervisor, then potentially be a lead of the functional area, and then take Yvette or Gloria's job. No, I'm kidding.
Maybe Beth.
Yeah, okay. No, I skipped her.
The other last point on this slide is that there may be a slight pay increase given the responsibilities of someone in the APS lead. Again, here we wanted to show what this may potentially look like, and in this illustration here, which is just an example, we broke the state out into 4 different regions, and we would have APS leads in each of those regions. We also included a very clever car there that shows the different drive times that staff may have.
Veronica, who's not here, who is here this summer, she is the young person that can do all of these charts. I draw and send it to her.
Yeah, this is what it made in our initial calculations, and we included some time estimates for what we thought it took someone to do an APS investigation from start to finish. We incorporated that into this model here. But given this is just an example, and we would need to really solidify how much time it's actually taking folks to do these cases from start to finish. And that's why we're recommending a slow rollout. So From here, we recommend, from what we're seeing with the caseload, that you would potentially need 9 APS leads. And similar to Dakota at home, start with a smaller number and just see how it plays out and works out with the situation. So potentially roll out with 4 or 5 APS leads and see how much time it's taking them, and then update the model. And well, you all would be able to better adjust how many APS leads you actually need across the state. So in this slide and next slide, we're going to talk about some of the quality measures. So we created a listing of quality measures and assigned those measures to each of the different functional areas. And those functional areas are based on the new revised org chart. And so a lot of these measures actually incorporates what you all are using today. And we just added in what we would consider to be best practice. And our main message here is really that each area should have metrics that it uses to drive performance, that it uses to evaluate if things are going well, if things are going bad. And that would be, like I said before, each functional area would have those measures. And what we provided is really just a starting point. So we identified these measures, either existing or new, and each of the leads within these functional areas would really need to look at each measure and see if it's even feasible. When we work with states on quality measures, the biggest issue is whether or not they can actually calculate the measure, and whether or not the return on investment is actually there, whether they want to spend all this money to actually evaluate that particular measure. So it's what's really going to play an importance here is whether the TheraP system is able to calculate and pull a lot of this information for you all. And from my understanding, the measures were sent to TheraP, and they're working to see what's feasible in their data systems.
Yeah, the last thing we want to do is create 3 weeks worth of work to get a couple quality measures when a data system can automate that, and it just kind of happens on the back end. That was something that we were really cautious about. We didn't want to create anything that's brand new that you'd spend weeks trying to figure out how many people do we need to talk to, which is to some extent some of that's done right now with some of the waiver measures, some of your 1915C performance measures. It's one time out of the year there's a lot of activity trying to figure out what are our measures that we need to report. And as much as that can be automated with the data that's being entered into the system, it frees up a lot of your time either during certain times of the year or at the end of the year for your annual reporting or in your 3-year, 4-year CMS reports. But it also gives the state office, supervisors, everybody kind of real-time snapshots of how are things going now. And when I was state director, I used to call them early warning systems. I wanted to know there was a problem before the newspaper did or before anybody else did. And these were things that, because you can get ahead of things whenever they're small problems but once they're big problems and you're $3 million over budget, there's not a whole lot you could do in June or May with a budget deficit like that. So we're gonna.
Yeah, I think we talked about feasibility, so that's also important. And then if it is a measure that you all would be able to calculate, then it's going through and seeing what the baseline would be, just as a starting point for you all to evaluate performance, and then also figuring out the frequency in which you want to collect some of these measures. Some may be you're collecting them real time versus something that you collect at the end of the year. And I know you all are pursuing the NCIAD, so that's one of those annual surveys that you all will get feedback on. And that's a survey that's conducted in person with the participant. So quality and dashboards really tie in together. You need the data and the performance measures to drive what you see in the dashboard. But our recommendation here is for you all to start using metrics to really start driving a dashboard so that each functional area is able to tell a story about how things are going for that group and what things aren't going well. And if things aren't going well, then you need to potentially make adjustments to your policies or add in additional quality measures. But the main point here is really just the story that you all can tell to legislators, to stakeholders about what's happening in your program. And when it comes to dashboards, like we see states use a lot of different approaches. We see states use a more low-cost approach where they just use an Excel-based dashboard, and that's something they publish every quarter and they put it online. And this is really in the PowerPoint we have here. This is just an illustration from what California uses. We also see states use a more interactive / web-based approach, which anyone can go on New York's website. New York has a web-based approach, and they can filter different metrics. So they can filter utilization, they can filter network adequacy, they can filter different quality metrics, but they can get information real time. So in New York, for example, that actually reduced the number of requests that they were getting from legislators. Legislators were always interested in new information, new metrics, trying to understand what's happening. And this was just, they could point the legislators to this homepage and the legislature could figure out what was happening. Another thing we recommend is if you all decide to release dashboards publicly, which is what we recommend, that you provide some context around what's happening. We've seen states just post information and not say anything, and then they get a million questions from people interpreting it. So it's really providing like an executive summary that would come with a dashboard that is released that tells the story, tells stakeholders what's happening, what the data is showing, is it normal, not normal, what you all have as a fix for something that would be considered to be an issue.
I think from the employee standpoint too, some of the dashboards can help you to feel like you're not crazy, right? Because sometimes you're feeling so burdened and overwhelmed and you're like, oh, nobody understands. But when the dashboard's shooting red light in this one area, then it makes you feel empowered because you can say, even the dashboard is saying I'm on fire. So your supervisors can say, yeah, she really isn't crazy, she's on fire.
So one example, and it's something that I use personally when I was state director, and we encourage a lot of the other state directors to do, is create measures that also help you justify particular activities and programs. And one of them is a legal assistance program. So it's a small program, and it's often a question on why are we funding legal assistance for people? Can't people buy afford their own attorneys? And there's an assumption that we do estate planning for people with $1 million estates, and so one of the measures we started creating and publicly reporting on was the amount of money that we saved individuals in particular communities through the legal assistance program. And it was always stuff we did was in Georgia. This was during the recession. A lot of people were being evicted from their homes. So how much do we save, and eviction costs and home ownership, and we were able to show that for like a $600,000 program, we saved across the entire state one year almost $50 million in fees and assets and resources for people. But we were able to tie it down to counties. And when we talked about how much money we saved in a particular county, and a legislator would ask, why do you have this program? Well, we saved $8 million in your county. And what would it take for you to bring in a new business that brought in $8 million? And this is how we retain that. So it makes Yvette's, Gloria's, even your ability, you're much more informed about the impact the programs are having and the reach that they have, and you're able to justify them for anybody who may believe the government needs to be smaller and less intrusive, and those types of measures. And you'll see those in the dashboards that we have, both within the legal assistance program. There are measures within the SHIP program on savings and prescription drug costs, for example, things that are already being reported by the individuals who run these programs. So these are all contracted out, and they report this. So they're not new measures. They've always been there. It's just never been anything that's trickled up to use at the state level because we'd never asked for it before. We had the program contracted out. They administer the program, and that's it. And we get the high level, how many people we served, without diving just a little bit deeper to say, really, what was the impact?
And we only shared one example of dashboards, but we typically see states using different dashboards depending on what they're looking at and depending on how their systems can interact. So I would expect for TheraOp there would be a dashboard that it's able to produce, but you would all probably need to have a separate dashboard being calculated from, I guess, the call center or however your financial information is coming through. But then obviously trying to pull all that together to be meaningful for folks to understand what's happening. One thing I was going to note on the quality measures, so we provided that listing of measures, and I think it's really helpful for folks to really start thinking about when they look through measures and understand how things are being calculated and where it's pulled and how it's pulled and whether it needs to be evaluated. There's been, when we've worked with states on looking at quality measures, been a lot of value in working through what it is they're collecting, because they've come to conclusions a lot of times they don't need to actually be collecting certain components, and they're spending money on the process for collecting it when it's not providing a good return on value. So taking the time to really sit down and understand what is needed from you all in each functional area to drive performance. You got law enforcement.
Yep. So, not necessarily the final thing, but close to it. We referenced APS. So APS has been a program that, the LTSS has been responsible before it moved over. That was a program in there. But it was probably one of the ones that across the surveys that we conducted, both the on-site interviews that Veronica and I did, state office interviews, and then we did some follow-ups in the surveys. The area that probably was, I'm not going to say the weakest, but had the least visibility and potential least impact because of the way it was administered and even to some extent the way it was understood. A lot of case managers, a lot of specialists talked about, how we have to do this, but we're not empowered. We don't have the ability to do certain things. We don't have resources available, or we don't understand what it is we're supposed to do. We're not trained to really do the investigation. So there's just a lot of things circled around it, which drove the recommendation for the specialization, but it also drove our desire to create that elder rights unit, which is at both the state level entity that's responsible for overseeing the protective services program, how that operates, but also developing some of those relationships. Because what we found, and I've worked with 8 probably different states now on protective services, is law enforcement has no idea what protective services does. They know what CPS does. They get a lot of training in their post-certification through the cadet academy that they're in cities on what child protective services is, what the expectations are, how they operate, and how you as an officer use those services. And there's a huge, robust federal infrastructure to support the CPS, protective services for children. They're, for the most part, considered first responders, meaning that if law enforcement calls CPS out at midnight, CPS has to be there. They have to go pick up that kid. They have detention centers. They have facilities. They have places they can bring kids. And law enforcement knows this. And when they hear protective services for adults, they have the same perception. Well, you do this. I'm calling you at midnight and nobody's answering your phones at midnight, wanting to know why aren't you doing anything. So it erodes their confidence in what it is you do because they don't believe that you're doing what you should be doing. And those are some huge bridges that need to be rebuilt or even built to some extent between what protective services does by statute, how they work with local law enforcement, and how the staff, LTSS staff, as well as who will become the leads, develop those relationships with the law enforcement community. Because there is, whether we don't like to talk about it, there's a lot of crime that happens. There's a lot of victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation in the state. We do the best job we can with the resources we have and the skills that we're given or the skills that we have developed, but we're still dependent upon the larger criminal justice system. We're dependent upon the police officers, if we find something criminal, to do their job, to go out there and do at least a preliminary investigation to see whether a crime occurred. And then once they do their job, then they hand it off to a district attorney. District attorneys have to see that what I did as an APS person and then what the law enforcement officer did is something that I can prosecute, because if I don't think I can prosecute it, I ain't going to do anything with it. And then our judicial system has to recognize that these crimes are crimes. They're not family matters. They aren't these domestic disputes. They are real crimes that have happened. And because there's this break within protective services to law enforcement, there's a disconnect in a lot of places. We need to start building on that. And that's kind of what our vision of the elder rights is, to start strengthening those relationships with the state DA. I think it's the DA is called here as the state law enforcement officer, and the local community DAs and sheriff's offices. Start developing those relationships, doing some joint training, so each partner understands what the other one does. Right now there's a handoff that happens, but it's a very informal handoff. We identify a crime, we refer it to law enforcement, and then we go about our lives. We just do our next thing, and we don't know whatever happens, or we don't often know what happens when we hand it up to law enforcement. Is that person still at risk? Or are they still being abused? Did law enforcement respond to it? Did they prosecute it? Do we need to go back in there and see if they need services now because somebody was arrested? Those connections are missing with the criminal justice system and the protective social services types of activities. So that's one of them. The other one is the formal interagency agreement, because APS is broader than just the aging side. It has responsibilities for adults with disabilities. when I'm doing an investigation, it's nice to have everything that I provide services for, right? So if I'm an LTSS specialist currently and I'm doing an investigation, I have access to everything in my system, but it's not always easy for me to get access to the other services and resources that a person might have because they are a resident and a citizen of South Dakota. Now, it may happen informally because I used to work in economic assistance, or I used to work in this agency, so I know somebody and I can call somebody, but it's informal and it doesn't happen consistently. So building those relationships both across the agencies and with law enforcement. The training piece I mentioned, and then standardizing the reports. Even among the staff that we spoke to, I think everybody was surprised. I'm trying to remember what the percentages was. A 56% increase in reports, APS reports from last year, year over year. I think when we finally got that number calculated, everybody at LTSS was shocked that we shared it with, that there was that large of an increase year over year without anything being done by you to drive up that number of calls of reports. And it's also recognizing that the reporting and the way it's documented was a little variable across the state, but a 56% increase year over year is pretty significant. At the local level, because there's no formality around how we do these handoffs and what we do as a result of a handoff to law enforcement for their criminal investigation, there's oftentimes a belief that these types of crimes don't happen in my community because I don't see them. Well, you don't see them because you're not trained to see them. You don't recognize that they're there. And by formalizing how we do these referrals and how we do follow-ups as a result of the referrals helps to raise the visibility at the local level for the criminal justice system to respond. And I think we hit on this one quite a bit, the case management piece. There were, I think, more often than not, as we were talking to the specialist, a recognition that we're not really specialists, we're generalists. We specialize in aging and some people with disabilities, but the programs that we have, we're generalists. We know superficially what's going on, and we depend upon a lot of people, and we may not do everything really well. And some of you were really clear with us that you don't feel like you can do a very good job because you are being asked to do so much and to know so much. So we spent a lot of time on the recommendation around the separation of the waiver case management versus a non-waiver, essentially. And we questioned whether it was doable. Is it worth it? In lots of different areas to be able to do this, even though it may look like a spread out map and supervision, and with the technology, with the new systems in place, and with the potential for leveraging the additional resources, federal resources that's available currently, if we adequately apply the human resources we have, it may be worth the, and I'm gonna use the term risk, but it's not necessarily a risk, but it may be worth the short-term disruption that it might cause in order to make sure that we have the resources we need long-term to be able to do the jobs that we're expected to do. And it made the most sense to look at it from the waiver side because that's the one where you can get into a whole lot of trouble because there's a lot of federal oversight, a lot of states are under audit right now for those services versus the non-waiver side, which is you still got to be cautious that you're following the rules, but those rules tend to be a little more flexible. So it's like the willow house or branch versus the oak branch. So your waiver services are the oak branch. They might bend a little bit, but then they break if you bend them too far. The non-waiver side, it's a willow branch. Y'all got willows here, right? You could, I used to get hit with a switch, with a willow switch, and those wrap around your leg. It's amazing how flexible they can be. But that's so that was kind of our thinking behind that is, let's specialize and make sure folks are really good at these services. And because there are so many different rules and regs and eligibility components to the waiver side, let's specialize there. And then have this case manager specialize in the non-waiver pieces. There will be, you will have to develop internally handoffs that'll happen when somebody transitions from a waiver or a non-waiver program to a waiver program, because that will happen. But again, when envisioning what this data system potentially can do and what you'll have access to, we think that it makes a lot of sense for that type of activity. And again, for lots of different reasons. One for compliance, one for the reporting, one for the critical incident management and what CMS expects, but also from the financial side of it. So when Gloria is trying to identify whether she has resources available, we may have just created, once this comes into full implementation, free resources for another 5-6 staff to do case management and to do these other activities, or for another supervisor, or because we need to develop some new programs, and it's all in the same bucket, so to speak. So those are, I think, high level, maybe a third of the various recommendations we had, ones that we felt most impacted you, the LTSS specialists across the state, that you need to be aware of what our recommendations were. And I'll summarize real quickly what LTSS and DHS has kind of identified as the next steps. One of them, when we started, was call center, the virtual call center. That's already been completed and implemented. It's in operation, and then the dedicated staff for the Dakota at Home. The data system was something that I may have been on the horizon when we first got involved last year, but now there's a contract signed and active implementation going on with the new therapy system. And then they have all the different stuff that we've created, that they can start building out some of these dashboards that we referenced in the quality measures. Going forward is identifying who the leads will be for both the cylinders that were created at the state office, but also at the local level for the APS side. Who were the folks? And we had some folks who felt really good about investigations, who had a background in CPS and who felt like they were really strong there. But we also heard that our colleagues in other departments who do this, they get a pay bump because they're taking on these extra risks. And we talked to Yvette, and this is a possibility for folks who raise their hand to say, I want to specialize in APS. I want to be that go-to person. So that's roughly between now and December. And again, once therapy is operational, assigning caseload. So who's going to raise their hand, or who wants to be the waiver case managers versus who wants to be the non-waiver folks. So that's the next step. So the next 6 months to a year, there's a lot of activity. There are other recommendations that we have in there that are kind of more long-term, and I'll call them aspirational only because if all of a sudden Gloria got handed $300 million in new funding, I think she would jump at doing all of it now. But that's just the reality of state government, is even though we know how much demand there is and how many additional resources we need to have, it's hard to always justify to the policymakers and the funders why we need these resources. So those will be things that Yvette and Gloria and Beth will look at, over the next year to say, how do we start accomplishing some of these pieces, and when we have an opportunity to do something, how do we make sure that gets done as we kind of envisioned. I have my question thing open, but we're at the questions point. If anybody has any
questions in the room?
Yeah, I do. I'm curious about, so I'm looking at the timeline, and that waiver versus non-waiver are going to be separated first. Are those APS leads going to be drawn from one or the other, or both?
Can you restate the question?
So the question was, when we look at the timeline and the waiver versus case management, waiver versus non-waiver case managers, will the APS leads be coming from one or both? As we were thinking about it, and again, I don't know that this is a decision, or any of these necessarily decisions, these are our recommendations that's been set in stone, is generally speaking, and it's been my experience, and like I said, I've administered 3 different protective services organizations in different states. The folks who wind up needing protective services tend to also, if they need community-based services, they tend to probably qualify for waiver services, the level of support that they need. So our thinking was probably they would come from the waiver case management side, because that's a resource that's available. Now, there are some other tricky things, not tricky, but there are other creative things that can be done on the waiver side, where we could give APS real tools, where when we write up our waiver, we amend our waiver, we say that we're going to give priority access to victims of abuse and neglect exploitation. So if there's wait lists that's available, these folks who can come right in without regard to a wait list and violating any type of federal rules around Olmstead or anything else, because that's something we heard as well, is we don't have resources for people. I mean, the only resources that we have as protective services is the resources the person has because they're alive. If they have a bank account, great, we could use that and help put services in place. But if they don't, if they're Medicaid eligible, then we have access to Medicaid. But other than that, we don't have a whole lot. And a lot of these folks tend to become Medicaid eligible really quickly because of what happened to them. They were wealthy and a relative came in and they wiped them out. And they have no resources. They sold the house, they sold everything. And by the time we get there, they're pretty much destitute. Now, we do a 5-year look back and, well, you just had all this kind of, activities. Well, now APS, because they're in that role, can say, yes, but they were a victim of abuse. These resources aren't available. They didn't violate the 5-year look back. They didn't have these resources that were stolen, so we can still get them enrolled. And that nuance helps move things along a little bit more quickly because they have that skill set.
Jane, can you talk about when you were evaluating the waiver versus the non-waiver, where the state plan folks fell, which group they fell in with?
Yeah,
I think we put, so the question was, when we evaluated the waiver versus non-waiver, where the state plan folks fall. I believe because the way we looked at that, it was still Medicaid, and it still had the same rules, eligibility, everything else, that they fell within the Medicaid waiver population. Now we called it waiver, but I mean,
it really was
Really
more Medicaid versus
Yeah.
non-Medicaid, so that if the non-Medicaid specialist would not just do Older Americans Act, but Social Services Block Grant, any other program that you're doing and administering through that.
That's what I kind of assumed that, but I just wanted to.
Yeah, no, that's a good clarification.
So we have a question online. I did see somebody did send us that question too. We recently implemented a transition coordinator position to manage HIEs across the state. What happens to that position? I don't think anything happens to that position. Their activities still remain the same to help manage the transitions. I believe if we talked about what way they would sit in the bucket, it would probably be in the long-term care bucket for that transition coordination.
Yeah, I think we did say that, right?
There has been talk about outsourcing waiver case management. Is this still in consideration, or will it no longer be needed with this new flow chart recommendation for staffing? And if it is still under consideration, how would outsourcing case management potentially affect specialized waiver case management? Most state plan cases also have, is that part of the same question? No, okay. So I think it's still the LTSS's desire to move toward an outsourced case management model for waiver activities. I think the delay, and Yvette, please correct me if I'm wrong, is more on the budgetary fiscal side of it. And if we're going to do this, and I kind of bluntly put it is, you either need to have some new resources or you need to free up resources elsewhere in order to outsource the case management component to it. Unless there's some other things you do with making it a component of like a state plan for people with multiple chronic conditions that don't necessarily draw upon your waiver budget. So I think it's still the goal long term. And actually the nice thing about it, if you want to look at it this way, is there's still going to be a need for the staff who do case management for the waiver services. Their roles as we move toward this new model, both now and then in the future where you're outsourcing it because of conflicts of interest, some other things, moves now toward more monitoring, oversight of the case management, of the services, of the providers, and having that really deep knowledge of the waiver program and how it works just lends to that person's credibility as they transition over into these new roles. Now, again, these are things that they'll be, I think, ideally phased in when the resources become available. And some of those resources could become available because we're now doing a better job at managing the resources within a waiver, the care plans within a waiver. We're, again, leveraging the federal match that's available for the staff that we're using. So there's all these other different, ancillary benefits from this that lend itself well to, what the future might hold in order to be, most flexible and amendable. Yvette, would you add anything to that?
I mean, just exactly that we look as when we are, if that's the way it continues to go and we wind up being able to implement an externalized case management, then we would look for those existing staff to move into more of a quality assurance role.
Yeah.
being the person who is editing the quality on those cases.
Yeah, and I'll just say, we've had some conversations both here in this state but other states on tiered case management, where one staff type does kind of traditional non-medical case management, and they continue to carry a caseload. And for folks who need both medical and HCBS services, like intent services, that you have a second tier of case management and that might be the contracted folks because they're able to, attract different types of employees or people who have an RN or LPN backgrounds to do that medical type of case management, and you revise your fee structure to reflect that. So those are all possibilities that once we kind of get a good handle on how things look, what does our population look like, what are our assessments for these different individuals look like, does it make sense to look at that model? Because right now it's pretty much a one-size-fits-all for case management. We assume that everybody needs the same type of services and supports, because that's what we had to offer right now is one type of case management for everything. But as you get more rich data and information on the clients through this new system, you'll start slicing and dicing and looking at do we have folks who are just heavily utilized in the emergency room and medical services, and they're unmanaged and they have multiple chronic diseases that we don't address right now, but they really need somebody to help address this holistically. Do we look at moving there first? And I think my reaction, if it was me, I'd say probably so. I think that's probably an area where I can generate some better outcomes for these consumers if I bring together the medical and the HCBS case management. But I can probably also generate savings in the Medicaid program because a lot of the medical costs are being hit to the Medicaid program. They, in the future there be the ability to share some of those savings. So if we're able to generate some of these savings in your program, let us develop this a little bit more and see how we move forward from there. Most state plan cases also have non-Title 19 services included for incontinence supplies, etc. What is the goal date of having? I think maybe that was just an informational piece. What is the goal date of having Therap operational? October? Was that it?
6 months, did we talk about? So.
In 6 months, that's the answer.
Yeah, so roughly in 6 months.
I mean, I think they can do it quicker, but we're trying to be cautious.
Yeah. Okay.
Cautious is good.
Yep. Yeah. So will APS leads be preferred to be from certain offices, Rapid City, Sioux Falls, or will they be available for other areas? So in the analysis that we did, it makes the most sense to start off in Rapid City, Sioux Falls, in those more populated areas, because that's where most of the cases are occurring right now. Now again, there's the big question that we have, and this is kind of why we're being conservative in our approach, is that was based on the data we had available. And as many of you know, the data wasn't or isn't always reliable to make those types of projections. But these are the two areas where just population demographics, density likely would create or have enough reports that this person is spending the majority of their time on these types of activities. Now, I will say that as the data becomes more reliable and as we have a better picture of where the reports come in and how often they come in, that it would be, incumbent upon the state to look at those reports and that map to say, all right, does it make sense for our third person or our fourth person or our fifth person to be here? And because APS is all done in the home or done at the, financial medical institutions, to look at where the cases are occurring. And I'll give you a really good example of why we're being conservative. When we were here last time, we gave that overview map of where the abuse cases were occurring. And we were going over the map with somebody, and they're like, well, why is this map, and I'm just pointing to the air for those of you who were listening, why is that county not shaded? I'm like, well, there were no reports that came in from that county. They're like, well, I just took a report a few months ago from that county. I'm like, well, if it didn't show up in the data system, our analysis said that there were no reports from that county. And that's what we talk about, kind of the data drives dollars. Today's day and age with the technology, I mean, you have to be able to justify certain things. And, My gut says that there are a lot more cases across the state than what is ever reported. I think because of the many hats that were being worn, even though you might have gone in there as an APS person, but it was a self-neglect. All right, well, that's just like anybody else, and they just need services. So let me put services in place, and that never gets coded as an APS referral. That got coded as a case management, as a Title 19, as a Older Americans Act, or whatever else it was, because you went in there and immediately you knew what it was. It wasn't abuse, neglect, exploitation. It was self-neglect, somebody who needed access to a service. So that's what we, as we looked at the data and as we looked at the time studies and how time was being allocated across the different things.
But we would expect the APS leads to be in those central locations where we are seeing most of the cases coming from.
Jay, could you talk a little bit about that self-neglect? Because since the implementation of Dakota at Home, we've gotten some questions from supervisors about cases like that. Why are they being put as APS that they just needed services?
Yep. Because unless somebody says otherwise, so you have a law that gets passed that says self-neglect isn't a
question.
So the question was, what I spent a little bit more time talking about the self-neglect piece, and some supervisors are questioning on why that's coded as A&E, an A&E call. So this is and I'm going to probably rattle on about this for a bit. If the person calling to make the report believes that abuse, neglect, exploitation is happening, we have to act upon that belief. Now, the person making the call, the reporter, it could be a mandated report, it could be a family member. They don't have the skills, they don't have the training, they don't have the background to be able to distinguish between what is somebody who just needs more food because they're low income, or somebody who's starving because their caregivers aren't feeding them. And I'll just kind of frame that because they're two sides of the same coin. There's a nutrition component to it. So from our perspective and our response, because the state law says that we investigate abuse, neglect, exploitation referrals, we have to treat it as an APS case. It doesn't matter if it's self-neglect or it's caregiver neglect. So what if it's a husband who's caring for his wife and both of them are starving because they don't have the resources available? So he's active, he has able to make decisions. His wife has dementia, and he's purposely not able to feed them, but aren't meeting the needs, and he's responsible. There's still neglect. It's maybe a better kind of neglect, right? Because he's trying, he's doing his best, and he just can't. And he's too proud to go ask for help, and he's able to make that decision for himself. So if I'm sitting here and I decide today that I just don't want him to eat anymore, I'm an adult, and I can make that decision. And you can come in here and talk to me all you would like, but you can't change my mind. And you legally can't change my mind. Now, you can take me to court, and you can have a judge, or a psychiatrist assess my competency, and then at that point you can take next steps. So every report that comes in as an APS, we have to treat as an APS, and there's laws around what that means. And when we get in there and we see it as self-neglect, does that person live alone? Is somebody in the house in a home with them? Is there a caregiver there that could address those needs? So even what might look like self-neglect, when we get in there, we have to, and this is where the training comes into play, and having the APS leads who are more skilled at this, has to look at kind of the entirety of the case to say, all right, so it's self-neglect, but is there a caregiver responsible for this person? Because if there is, and that caregiver is not meeting their needs, that self-neglect now just became an active neglect case. Even though this person might live independently, and I'll give you an example with my grandmother. My grandmother lived with me after Hurricane Katrina for 5 years. I was primarily responsible. I got her to the doctor. I fed her. She lived with me. If she fell and somebody reported it, they would come and investigate this. Now, she wanted to move into her own apartment, so we got her into senior housing. I was still responsible for the doctor. I was still responsible for groceries. I was still responsible, and I assumed, not formally through legal activities, but I assumed that role and that responsibility. She was completely dependent upon me. She didn't drive anymore. Now, let's just say I decided to go out of town for 2 weeks and left her in her apartment and didn't give her groceries, didn't give her anything. Is that self-neglect or is that neglect? That's neglect. Now, if you just went in there and talked to her, she probably would cover for me. She wouldn't want me to get in trouble. But I abandoned her, even though she was in her apartment. I assumed this responsibility to be responsible for her care, and it was presented by I had access to her checking account. I had healthcare power of attorney. I had all these the legal documents here that were necessary, but she wasn't living with me. I wasn't neglected anymore. I moved her out. She was on her own. So that's why, like I said, the self-neglect, you treat it as an A&E case. And then these were needs that weren't being met that the person had. And because you approached it as an APS, under an APS investigation, one, it gets tagged. So now we know we have one more case of abuse, neglect, exploitation that happened. So when we're advocating for more resources, it counts from that perspective, because we want to be able to make the case that we need more resources for this. But then from the federal side and in the match side, let's say that it is self-neglect, but I spend the next 3 weeks trying to set them up for protective services. Medicaid services. I want to get waiver services in there. I want to get nutrition. I want to get all these other things in there. Now, because right now under our structure, or at least our proposed structure, that individual would also be doing managing Medicaid, likely those activities could be or would be matched under the Medicaid admin match for that time. But if we have a mixed caseload, which is what you have right now, where you do waiver and non-waiver, and let's just say you went in there and you spent 3 weeks of your time spending on getting protective services in for this individual, because you did it kind of as a, I'm trying to get the best terminology, as a multi-service approach without any clear guidance on how and what your time spent on those activities was. It was just basically paid for 100% by the state, that amount of time. So those 3 weeks of your time that was spent could have drawn down, and I hate to tie it back to money, but it drives a lot of these decisions, could have generated an extra $20,000 in federal match because these were activities that were matchable. Because it was an APS case and because I was trying to connect them to Medicaid resources and Medicaid services, which might not be available if you didn't approach it from that direction as well. And again, I guess I'm talking on and on and on, but I go back to self-neglect is still neglect. And then the other component to it is, and this is where again the skilled piece comes in, is did that person have the competency to be able to decide that they wanted to live that way? Because, that, again, if you go out there as an APS investigator and a person's living in squalor and, hadn't vacuumed their floors in 6 years and dishes and no running water, and if they say, I'm fine living like this, I'm happy, it's okay, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. But if they don't have competency, and we left them like that, then we're culpable to some extent to say that individual needed services. I was out there and I left without doing anything about it. So that's why we kind of approach it. Even what might look like self-neglect when you get there, still an APS case, is still an investigation that needs to happen, both by law and then by practice. And then I'm not even tying into the Medicaid side and CMS on critical incidents and health, safety, welfare, and keeping people free from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Because from CMS's perspective, self-neglect is still a failure. So those of you who have a waiver case management caseload and you identify somebody who's self-neglecting, from CMS's perspective, that is a failure. That this person, we didn't act and we didn't do what we needed to do to protect this person from living like they are. So that's a long answer, but I get a little bit passionate about it. Will APS leads get additional training? I would like to say yes. Once somebody's identified as an APS lead, they need to have some additional level of training to become competent, and not only from an externally skills perspective, but internally. So they have the confidence to know that they can go in there and do these types of investigations. What tends to happen when you don't have that kind of additional training is, so financial exploitation. How many of you love a financial exploitation investigation? Going to the bank and getting bank records and trying to show that money was stolen, and nobody likes it. I mean, I had 180 APS investigators. All of them were social workers. None of them felt that they were good in math. None of them wanted to calculate anything. None of them wanted to do so our financial investigations were nil. There was zero. because they weren't comfortable doing that type of investigation. Now, there's always that part to it. Almost any type of APS abuse is driven by a financial aspect of it. It's just the reality of what it is. That person has some access to resources, unless again if it's self-neglect. But even then, somebody may have stolen their money, and all you're seeing is one part of it. So there's a need for that specialized training to how do we conduct an investigation, but not only that, how does the investigation and notes that we take and the documentation that we do, how does that translate over whenever we hand it off to law enforcement? Does law enforcement feel comfortable with what it is we just wrote up, or are they going to have to go do and replicate everything we just did? And I would say that we need to create something that law enforcement recognizes, because when they look at our social service notes that our social work background trained us to do, they have no idea what it is we're saying. Even though it has everything in there, they don't recognize it. We don't use their language. So there's training that needs to happen. And there's some online training. NAPSA, National Association of Protective Service Administrators, has some online training, some certifications that are available. So I think that would be something that my guess is LTSS would probably tie that to the pay increases. Once the certification's achieved, then you qualify for that lead role as an APS specialist.
And we would also expect some extensive training on the policy and structure for, the APS lead and how they get cases and all the information and how they finalize the case as well through the system.
Yep. So we missed the answer to the question, will APS leads have a waiver caseload? Initially, our recommendation is yes, they would have a waiver caseload. It would be a smaller caseload. Probably what we're thinking right now is 70% APS investigations, and then 40% waiver, and then closely underscore. That's one of the dashboard measures for looking at least monthly.
70 and 30.
70 and 30. 70 and 30. See
Sorry,
the math
you
piece.
said you didn't like math.
No. 70-30, and then the state office closely looks at that, and that's one of the dashboard measures that we're recommending, because if we're not managing that, and it's going to be fluid, it could quickly either 100% of the time spent on one piece and we just completely neglected that they had this waiver caseload that the priority is APS, and so those need to be monitored closely by the state office to make sure that the resources are available. But it will be a waiver caseload.
I think it'll really too be dependent on the particular region they're located and how many staff are assigned to that region. Because when we were doing the initial analysis, which we had 9 EPS leads, their caseload really did vary depending on where they were located. So some had actually as low as 50%, and then others had, as Jay talked about, 70 to even 80, 90%. Yeah. But a lot of that should be driven from data and how much time it takes folks to do these and do an initial rollout to see what that may potentially look like.
So, and the report goes into this. Long term, we see the APS leads not only, I do believe strongly that they will become APS specialists in a year or two. And once they become specialists, and that's all they do is investigations, that their role also leverages and reinforces and supports the state office's role on elder rights. So unfortunately, APS, we can't schedule our caseloads. We can't say, sorry, our caseloads at our max, hold off, they'll be abused for a couple of weeks until we're able to clear this one off. So there will be times when folks are just swamped and overwhelmed. And there'll be some times when they have downtime, and that downtime from an APS perspective should be doing education in the community and working with law enforcement and building those relationships at the local level that the elder rights team will be building at the state level as well. So there's a vision in the report that says, when they are full-time APS, they're not just investigations, because we know at least we don't think there's going to be enough cases that they're constantly going to be at full capacity. How do you use that time to develop relationships, to raise awareness, and to preventively act to reduce abuse, neglect, and exploitation? Because that's part of our goal. So protective services shouldn't always be reactive. We ought to be working as much as we can to reduce instances of abuse. And you do that through education, you do that through training of the community partners and whoever, the other folks in the communities might be. And right now, I could ask for a show of hands, when's the last time you did a in-service for a law enforcement agency? Anybody in this room? So one person did, and those should be things that happen pretty regularly within a context of protective services, because these are the law enforcement community are your partners. You carry the ball first, but they carry it to the end if we're going to see some change. And I use the term when I was in Georgia, it's like we need to make elder abuse illegal again. because we had laws, but for the first 3 years that I was there, and before that, nobody ever got prosecuted. Like, and I kid you not when I say nobody ever would prosecute. So you can exploit somebody for $3 million and pretty much walk away and never have a criminal record, because there was never that clean handoff, and there was a misunderstanding on what the roles were. I don't know that he answered that. I would assume long-term care. Oh, yeah, that was the transition. I'm sorry, that was the trans. So on the new transition coordination position for the HIE, that position is unchanged, and it likely sits within the long-term care cylinder of the org chart. So Angie was right, assume long-term care.
One of the things the state asked us to do too was for each of the areas, not just for adult protective services, but part of putting the career ladders in place for everybody is to figure out what training and opportunities there are for each of the various functional areas. So we put together the online classes that are currently available, the conferences that are currently available, et cetera, for all of those areas. And I know that for the Dakota at Home, they've already availed themselves of some of the training, both from NASUAD, but also from AIRS. I think Jennifer went down to AIRS conference, and they're getting their certifications too. So that's a nice thing to be celebrating.
Anything else?
Are there any questions
Trying to
in
find
here?
my right lens here.
It just got really dark in here, I realized.
I know. we're putting you to bed.
It's too dark in here.
Until changes start happening.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, Yvette will be sending out, I guess, via email a high-level executive summary of the report and all the recommendations, and the PowerPoint as well. What about the intake worker question above? Oh, I didn't see that one.
Your eyes just all got real big when I turned the lights on.
Have your recommendations surrounding intake staff carrying a caseload changed? No, it hasn't changed. So what we identified with the Dakota at Home, we had, in talking to the different staff, there was a type of individual who were on all your caseloads who received only telephonic, and I'll call it case management, but it was really basically assessments to see whether they still wanted the services they were getting, and I think it was called basic services, right? So we had recommended that move over to the ADRC as their caseload, not knowing what the call volume would look like and not knowing how much time these activities took. I think it wasn't very long before Yvette and Beth identified that they're not able to do all the different assessments in the time that they had available. So I believe that there are policy changes that are going into effect soon to adjust those, at least some of those individuals who don't necessarily need to get that annual call or annual or biannual assessment or reassessment to address some of that. And then I don't know if we have enough data from the call center yet to know whether the staffing looks appropriate to handle the calls. Okay. Yeah, Yvette's walking up here because she wants to expand upon that a little
Well,
bit.
just as we started looking at
That's the one.
the folks and trying to do all of those basic services and answer the phone, they were getting kind of overwhelmed with the idea of moving more cases into them. But we really found out a lot of it was because of our policy. So we looked at adjusting our policy that we don't have to try and call somebody 3 times to get in touch with them. We'll just send out a notice saying we're trying to get in touch with you and have them respond back to us rather than spending quite so much time on the phone. And a few other policy changes like that, that interestingly enough, some of the staff who are not intake specialists said, well, if I don't have to call them 3 times, I'll keep that caseload. That's not near so bad to do then.
Right.
So I'm not sure where it's all going to shake out in the end, but we did take out some. We're trusting people a little bit more to call us when they need us.
And that's, so that's exactly the type of activities you want to see happening at the state office. So when you look at the workload, is it necessary work or is it work that we have because of policy that we have in place. And I'm glad to hear the approach that you took. I mean, we had in Georgia when I was state director, we went through a very similar process. We had a wait list of 20,000 people. And our policy was those 20,000 people had to be called, and there were some of them who ours was a tiered wait list, so it was based on your level of need, and some of them based on the level of need, so it was the highest need got services first. Some of them we calculated would be 15 years, 10 years before they ever got a call. It's like, do you really want us calling you back every year to see whether you still want to stay on the wait list? And we made a policy change. We got public comment, and we sent a letter saying, it's going to be, and we put the years. We estimate it would be 5 years, 10 years before you'd be eligible for service. Would you like us to continue calling you every year to ask you if you still want to stay on a wait list, or will you contact us? And almost everybody said, we'll contact you if there's a change in our need. So that was almost immediately 20,000 people who weren't having to be called every year, and it was broken off. It wasn't one time of the year. But that's the type of activities you want to see happen at the state, to say, we spend a lot of time on this. Is it really necessary? Or can we change our policy and free up our time to be able to do things more effectively and still meet the needs of the consumer? We still want to be available to them through the ADRC, through the Code at Home if they have some needs, and we'll let them know. We give them a pamphlet, a brochure, whatever we need to make sure they have access to it. So.
I have a question.
Yep.
Will each new role that you guys have put out for the reorganization have a job description available in the executive summary? Have you decided that?
Job description.
Not an executive.
It's not in the executive summary. It's in the full report.
Can you repeat the question?
I'm sorry.
Will the executive summary have a job description for the new roles?
It's not in the executive summary. It's literally almost a listing of the recommendations. In the full report, there are the job descriptions, but that's something I guess you've bet. And
Yeah.
you can decide how you want to handle that.
Well, and we still have to take those to BHR and see
Yeah.
how they fit in that structure, so that'll come.
Can you also repeat what you just said?
They're in the full report, but those will likely have to go through BHR to see how that plays out. So as much as we'd like to be fully authorized to make any change whatsoever, regardless of state politics or infrastructure, we can't.
Darn.
My magic wand's broken.
Are cases automatically going to be assigned to the specialist, whether they're waiver or non-waiver, or are the specialists going to get a chance to say, I want to do the non-waiver versus the waiver?
So the question was, will the case managers be assigned a waiver or non-waiver, or will they have a chance to say whether they want to be waiver or non-waiver case managers? Was that about it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And Yvette, if you want to answer that, or
We're going to defer to you.
Yeah.
I'll
Okay.
shout it and you can repeat it. Our preference would be that specialists would indicate their preference and we could meet those to the degree that we can.
Yeah. So our preference would be that they would make their preference known, and we'd try to accommodate that as much as we can. But I will add on that some of you have already, for some form or fashion or reason, kind of identified yourself as a primarily waiver or non-waiver caseload manager. When we look at the distribution, some folks have probably 60-70% of their caseloads are either waiver or non-waiver. Now, it's just how the data looks. Now, the data may not be completely accurate, but there are some folks who I think, either they're really strong at one or the other, or for some reason they tend to fall, the majority one direction or the other.
But in that realm of questioning, if you are doing just waivers, if you're doing non-waiver, will your caseload be higher? Was there some discussion about that?
Yeah. So and again, so the question is, if you're doing waiver or non-waiver, will your caseloads be higher? And I'm trying to be cautious here. If we looked at the data, if we looked at your data, let me rephrase that. If we looked at how you said you spent your time, individuals would have a much greater caseload for one type of service than another. But it doesn't go in the right direction that I would think. So according to what you put down in your time studies, individuals with a waiver caseload should be able to manage 120 people. And I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit, but that's the way it looks on your time allocation studies that have been done across the entire state for the past year. So right now, the average caseload is about 100, 108, 110, somewhere around there. In a lot of cases, a lot of places, that's mostly, or the majority, non-waiver. But when you look at the time study, you know, and I would say probably 60, maybe that one's 60-40, 60% non-waiver, 40%, except for some people. But even that 40% of your cases that are waiver, with the amount of time you spend on it, at least on a reporting perspective, you could manage a lot more than what you do. Now, I will tell you that if you manage the waiver the way CMS expects it to be managed, you should have a much smaller caseload than what you do, and what so our assumption is that the non-waiver caseloads would be slightly higher. Now, what percent higher? I don't know. I think it varies by area and by region. Now, and here's the nuance around it is, remember, right now we're not fully maximizing the federal match for the waiver side. So maybe after a short period of time, we created 4 new positions for waivers, and some of that funding doesn't need to stay in a waiver. We can move it into the non-waiver side. But that portion of it is not necessary to be able to adjust the caseloads. I don't know that really answered your question, because the data that we're working with doesn't give us enough information outside of saying that nationally, waiver case management is a lot more difficult than non-waiver case management.
I'm just going to jump in there and say, too, that TheraP is going to change things for us a lot, because with waiver and non-waiver, you're spending a lot of time doing and redoing tasks, and faxing and printing and filing and scanning and all kinds of things that should all go away with TheraP. So it's going to free up time overall, which is going to influence everything we do down the road.
Yeah, the other part of it is the efficiency factor that we haven't built into any of our assumptions. So, and what does that mean? I'll use me and Dustin as a really good example. I cost a lot more than Dustin costs, but we get asked to do the same thing sometimes, billing and invoicing. And I can do an invoice, and it takes me 6 hours to do an invoice. Because I'm not good at it. I don't do it very often. It's not something that I encounter day to day. Dustin can get it done in 30 minutes, probably quicker than that. Every month I struggle with it, because I only touch it once a month. I don't do it very often. There is a huge efficiency factor to specializing the activities, and it goes much broader than what we're talking about here. I mean, it's in the activities, it's in the speed at which you're able to do certain things, it's in your how attuned you are to what it is that needs to be done, and how it's done, and what the outcomes are going to be. But at the supervisor level as well, there's an efficiency factor in managing one type of program instead of 8. And there's actually a lot of national studies on this piece where, if I'm only managing one type of staff who only has one type of activity, I probably can competently do that at a 1-to-12 ratio. But whenever I'm now responsible for managing 4 different staff types or 3 different staff types with 5 different programs, that efficiency factor drops down to about 1-to-5 to 1-to-6, because I now have to be cognizant and aware of all these different program factors and how they all work. So we haven't taken any of that into consideration, because again, the data will improve going forward with the new system, with how your time's being spent, what's being documented, and everything else. And I think it will drive a lot of decision making going forward.
And the 2 analyses that we did, so for the APS and then for the waiver specialization, we really pulled that together to see if it was feasible, to see if it looked reasonable, and both analyses show that it is, but a detailed analysis hasn't really been done to look at, okay, if we do APS specialization, if we do caseload specialization, what is this going to look like on the map, and how is the caseloads going to change? When we were looking at caseloads, for example, like your question may be stemming from the chart that has the variations in caseloads depending on waiver and non-waiver. And that analysis was really just looking at, okay, we have cases in this region, we have staff in this region, okay, what does the split look like? We would expect in the final decision that your feedback and others' feedback about how much time it actually takes to do these things would be incorporated into what the caseload makeup actually is for staff. So on that front, in your question, I think that's to be determined on what that may potentially look like.
That's also influenced by the amount of poverty in each community.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
a small percentage.
Are there any more online?
Nope. Just intake worker question that we answered on the transition court. Oh, of the caseloads.
Anything else?
I'll stop, or I can end it with a story, because I'm good at telling stories. My dad lives in, or lived in a rural part of Canada, and he called me. It's a beautiful, beautiful lake, and huge, majestic trees and cabins and everything. And he called, and his voice was horrible, and he said that they had just experienced something akin to like a tornado, that it was called a Jericho. It's an upside down tornado, and it ripped the trees, and they lost almost every tree, and almost every cabin had damage and stuff. And it was devastating, because for 50 years I'd gone up there and seen the lake the way it was. And so the first time I went up, everything was in such a state of flux, and there was just kind of chaos everywhere I looked. And the second time I went up, 6 months later, there were flowers that I'd never seen, because the trees had been so high before that nothing was able to get to the sunlight below, and nothing would ever bloom. But there were flowers everywhere, and many of the changes that my dad had wanted to make on some of the cabins, he hadn't made, because he was in his 80s and he hadn't made them. But when he had the money from the insurance adjuster and stuff, he made these beautiful changes. And it just became this wonderful new avenue for all of us to look at it through this kind of disruptive change and kind of nightmarish situation. We actually got to see flowers and blooming and these beautiful new buildings. And I think sometimes, well, always, change is difficult for everybody, I think, when you are experiencing it from either the leadership part or from the staff part. And, you know, from the daughter part, it was terrifying. I'm not going to lie. That change was very upsetting. But it is now, all these many years later, just a beautiful thing. And I think that if you can relax and realize that change can be really good, I think it'll be helpful. And I think also keep in mind how I started the conversation by talking about the leaders here in South Dakota have been so easy to talk to for us, and have been doing the change as they're going through the process, not waiting for the final report, but just like today, you know, she's saying, well, they said this was causing this, and so we've made this policy change. That's what's going to make all of the changes easier for everybody, I think, going forward, is just knowing that. And also making sure that you understand that you can communicate up to the leaders if there are certain things that are happening. They want to hear from you so that they can make the change appropriately. Last thoughts?
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.